They thought she was lost. They thought she was confused. They thought a black woman in a worn peacoat, standing in the lobby of a 5-star hotel at 7 in the morning, with a duffel bag over her shoulder and mud on her boots, could only mean one thing: trouble. They were wrong about everything. On a grey Thursday morning in downtown Atlanta, a security supervisor named Grant Pelham made the kind of mistake that unravels careers. He saw a woman who didn't match his idea of the clientele. He saw a problem to be removed. What he didn't see, what he refused to see, was the silver insignia on the lanyard tucked inside her jacket, or the 26 years of military service behind the eyes that looked back at him without flinching. What he didn't know was that Colonel Serena Obi Weston had been awake for 31 hours straight, had just stepped off a military transport from a forward operating base in East Africa, and was standing in the lobby of the Harrington Grand, not as a guest, but as the keynote speaker for the National Veterans Leadership Summit, an event that would begin in 4 hours in the ballroom on the 3rd floor. He had 9 minutes to do the right thing. He chose wrong. And what happened next would put his face on every news channel in the country by nightfall. The Harrington Grand was the kind of hotel that polished its own reputation the way it polished its marble floors, obsessively, constantly, with the awareness that appearances were everything. The lobby alone cost more to renovate than most Atlanta families earned in a decade. Crystal fixtures, custom stonework, a front desk staffed by people trained to smile with their eyes. It was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small without ever saying a word. Colonel Serena Obi Weston had stayed in worse. She'd slept in forward operating bases with mud walls and no electricity, in desert tent camps, where the temperature swung 40 degrees between midnight and noon, in field hospitals that smelled of antiseptic and fear. A marble lobby didn't impress her. Neither did the man walking toward her with his chest puffed and his jaw set like he'd already made a decision. Grant Pelham was the kind of security supervisor who wore his authority the way insecure men wear expensive watches, loudly, constantly, hoping someone would notice. He was 43, thick through the shoulders, with a close-cropped haircut that hadn't changed since 1998. He had worked hotel security for 11 years and had developed the habit, common among men in his position, of making judgments in the first 3 seconds and spending the rest of the interaction proving himself right. He looked at Serena and saw a woman who didn't belong. She was 47 years old, 5'8". Her peacoat was a deep charcoal, practical and worn, the kind that had survived actual weather. Her boots were Morel trail shoes, still carrying faint traces of red clay from the Kenyan highlands she'd been standing in 36 hours ago. Her natural hair was pulled back tightly. She carried a single duffel, military issue, olive green, and she walked with the precise, unhurried gait of someone who had navigated far more hostile terrain than a hotel lobby. To Grant Pelham, she looked like she had wandered in off the street. "Excuse me." His voice was already loaded with dismissal before he'd finished the first syllable. "Can I help you?" Serena didn't stop walking. She had clocked him the second he stood up from his station. She'd spent 2 decades reading threat assessments. A hotel security guard with an attitude didn't register particularly high on the scale. "I'm checking in," she said, continuing toward the front desk. Pelham stepped sideways, intercepting her path. "The front desk is busy. I'm going to need you to hold right here for a moment." Serena stopped. She looked at him. The front desk was not busy. There was 1 guest being helped and 2 attendants standing available. This was not a crowd management issue. This was something else entirely. "The front desk looks fine to me," she said, her voice even, unhurried, the tone of a woman who had briefed generals and hadn't found the experience particularly intimidating. "I'm going to ask you to wait over there." Pelham pointed toward a seating area near the entrance, positioned in a way that was clearly intended to move her away from the desk and closer to the door. "I'm not going to wait over there," Serena said. "I have a reservation." Pelham's eyes dropped to the duffel bag and came back up with a question already formed into a conclusion. "Under what name?" "Colonel Serena Obi Weston." He didn't write it down. He didn't reach for a radio to check with the desk. He tilted his head slightly and said, "You got some I do," she said, "and I'll show it to the front desk when I check in, like every other guest. I'm going to need to see it before you approach the desk." A guest in a business suit walked past both of them and went directly to the front desk without being stopped. He was white. He carried a roller bag. Pelham didn't turn his head. Serena watched this happen. She said nothing about it, but she filed it away with the precision of someone trained to document everything. "My identification," she said, slowly and clearly, "is for the front desk, not for you." Pelham's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being contradicted, especially not in this measured, unhurried way that somehow made him feel smaller than shouting would have. He gestured to a younger colleague, a man named Vic, who was stationed near the elevator bank and who had been watching the exchange with visible discomfort. "Vic, come here." Vic approached with the energy of someone who had already made a private moral calculation and wasn't fully comfortable with which side of it he'd landed on. "This guest is refusing to provide identification," Pelham said. The word guest landed with visible quotation marks around it. "That's not accurate," Serena said, addressing Vic directly. "I said I would show my identification at the front desk. That's standard procedure. What your supervisor is requesting is not." Vic looked at Pelham, then back at Serena, then at his own shoes. "Ma'am," Pelham said, stepping closer, dropping his voice in a way that was meant to feel like a warning. "I'm going to need you to either produce ID right now, or I'm going to ask you to leave the property. You're going to ask a registered guest to leave the property until you can verify that you are a registered guest by showing you identification that I've already said I'll show at the desk." "Ma'am." "Don't ma'am me in that tone." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was a quality to it that Vic would describe later to investigators as the sound of someone who had given orders that decided whether people lived or died and was now applying 1/10 of that energy to a hotel lobby in Atlanta. "I know what you're doing. I know why you're doing it. And I'm giving you one more opportunity to step aside and do your job correctly." Pelham didn't step aside. By the time the Atlanta Police Department responded, Serena had been standing in the lobby for 11 minutes. She had not raised her voice. She had not moved toward the desk. She had stood exactly where Pelham had positioned her, near the entrance, near the door, in the corner designated for people who were being managed rather than served. She stood the way she'd stood in debriefing rooms after operations that went sideways, still, watching, cataloguing. The officer who arrived was young, Officer Damon Fitch, 28 months, on the job, still in that phase of law enforcement where the uniform feels like borrowed authority. He was not a bad person. He was a person who had been handed a situation framed entirely by one side before he'd seen the other. "Ma'am?" He approached cautiously, cap in hand, radio, gnat crackling. "I'm Officer Fitch. I understand there's been a situation here." "There has been," Serena agreed. "Can you tell me what's going on?" "I came to check in to my reservation. Your hotel security supervisor stopped me before I could reach the desk and has been demanding I show identification to him rather than at check-in, which is not hotel procedure." Pelham appeared at Fitch's elbow. "She's been non-cooperative and refuses to provide ID." Fitch looked between them. "Ma'am, do you have identification?" "I do. Would you be willing to show it to me?" Serena looked at Fitch for a moment. She made a decision. "I will show you my ID," she said. "Not because you have legal authority to demand it in this situation, but because you at least asked instead of demanded." She reached into the inner pocket of her peacoat. She did not reach quickly. She moved deliberately, the way a person moves when they are aware that fast movements in lobbies with officers present can end in ways that have nothing to do with hotel reservations. She produced her military ID first, Department of Defense, embossed, official. Then, behind it, she slid out a second card and held both toward Fitch. Fitch looked at the first card. "Read it." His posture shifted. Pelham craned his neck to see. Fitch handed both cards back to Serena, with considerably more care than he'd used in approaching the conversation. "Mr. Pelham," Fitch said, and his voice had changed. "Did you verify this guest's reservation before requesting she leave the property?" Pelham's certainty flickered for the first time. She refused to show ID. She has a valid government-issued military ID identifying her as a colonel in the United States Army. Fitch paused. "Did you check the reservation?" Pelham stopped. He had not checked the reservation. He had looked at a woman with a duffel bag and mud on her boots and made a decision that would follow him for the rest of his professional life. "Check the reservation," Fitch said. His tone had crossed a line that went from suggestion to instruction. Pelham's jaw worked silently. He turned to the front desk. The attendant, a young woman named Petra, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing horror, was already typing before he reached the counter. She looked at the screen. She looked at Pelham. She looked at Serena. Something moved across her face that was equal parts relief and pity. "Colonel Obi Weston," Petra said, projecting her voice across the lobby with the deliberate clarity of someone making a record. "Your suite on the 14th floor is ready. We've also confirmed your speaker arrangements for the Veterans Leadership Summit. The event coordinator left a message this morning. They're expecting approximately 300 attendees for your keynote." The lobby went quiet. Not silent, the ambient sounds of the hotel continued, the elevator chime, the distant sound of the restaurant, the soft orchestral loop through the speakers. But the social noise, the hum of normal transactional life, stopped as the weight of what had just happened settled over the room. Pelham stood at the front desk. He did not turn around. Serena walked past him without looking at him. She stopped at the desk, produced her ID for Petra in the normal, conventional, unremarkable way that every guest produced their ID, and accepted her room key in a small envelope. "Thank you, Petra," Petra said, and she meant more than the words. Serena rode the elevator to the 14th floor alone. She set her duffel on the bed, stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the Atlanta skyline in the grey morning light, and allowed herself 30 seconds to feel whatever it was she was feeling. She had felt it before. The specific, bone-deep exhaustion of having to be correct in situations where being correct required performance, composure, restraint, and absolute precision. While someone with less experience, less training, and less authority treated her like a variable to be managed, rather than a person to be served. She had felt it at checkpoints in other countries. She had felt it in budget meetings at the Pentagon. She had felt it decades ago, as a young lieutenant walking into rooms where no one expected her to be both young and female and black and right. She was tired of being right in a way that required that much effort. But she had learned, a long time ago, that the exhaustion was not an excuse to stop. It was information. It was fuel. She unpacked her dress uniform from the duffel, pressed, immaculate, somehow surviving the journey from East Africa with the crisp authority of something that had its own opinions about presentation. She laid it on the bed. She showered. She made coffee with the room's machine and drank it standing up, because she had been trained to maximize transition time, and because sitting felt like surrender to a tiredness she couldn't afford yet. At 9:45, her phone rang. It was Brigadier General Antoine Burrell, the event's military liaison, and the man who had personally lobbied to bring her in as keynote. "Serena, tell me what happened." "How do you know?" Petra called the event coordinator. "The event coordinator called me. I've been awake since 6, and I've been making calls since 8. Antoine, the hotel's director of operations, is on his way in. The regional manager is joining by phone. They want to speak with you before the event. I have a keynote in 3 hours. I know, so do they. They're very aware of the timeline." He paused. "How are you?" The question caught her off guard the way genuine questions sometimes do. She looked at her uniform on the bed. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm used to it." "You shouldn't be," he said. "Nobody should be." At 10:30, Serena sat in a conference room on the 2nd floor across from a man named Director of Operations Lawrence Thibault, who had the look of someone who had rehearsed an apology in the car, and was now discovering that the actual delivery was more complicated than the rehearsal. Beside him was the hotel's regional manager joining by video, a woman named Karen Solis, who was visibly uncomfortable and trying to hide it behind professionalism. Brigadier General Burrell sat to Serena's left. "Colonel Obi Weston," Thibault began, "I want to start by saying—" "I'd like to start," Serena said, "by asking one question." He stopped. "How many other guests were asked to show identification before reaching the front desk this morning?" Thibault looked at his folder. "He did not have that number." "That's what I thought," Serena said. "Not cruelly, factually. We are conducting a full internal review. I'd like to know what that review will look like. Specifically, not in general terms." Solis leaned toward her screen. "Colonel, we take this incident extremely seriously." "You should," Serena said. "I've operated in 31 countries. I've briefed heads of state. I've managed operations in active conflict zones. I came to this hotel as a guest, as a speaker, and as someone who represents the veterans this summit is designed to serve. What happened in that lobby this morning was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. Misunderstandings don't wait for a second person to be stopped while a white guest walks past unchallenged." The room was quiet. "Mr. Pelham," Thibault said carefully, "has been placed on administrative leave pending review." That's a beginning, Serena said. It is not a conclusion. Burrell, who had said nothing, allowed himself the faintest smile. The National Veterans Leadership Summit had been running for 11 years. It gathered active duty service members, veterans, military families, policy advocates, and community leaders from across the country for 2 days of panels, discussions, and what the brochure called actionable dialogue. It was serious work dressed in conference clothing, and the people who attended it took it seriously. The ballroom on the 3rd floor held 312 people when Serena walked to the podium at 1:15 in the afternoon. She was in full dress uniform now, colonel's insignia, service ribbons, the visual vocabulary of 26 years rendered in metal and fabric. She looked, as one attendee would write later, like someone who had already won several arguments before she said a word. She stood at the microphone and looked out at the room for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, I was stopped in the lobby of this hotel and asked to prove that I belonged here before I could reach the front desk. I want to tell you what I thought about standing in that lobby. The room went completely still. I didn't think about rank. I didn't think about my service record or my clearance level or the fact that I was the keynote speaker. I thought about every person in a uniform or out of one who gets stopped in a lobby, in a store, on a street corner and has no rank to fall back on, who has no summit waiting for them on the 3rd floor, who is just a person asking to be treated like one. She paused. The badge, the uniform, the title. These things help me today. They should not have had to. The minimum standard is not rank. The minimum standard is humanity. Somewhere in the room, someone started clapping before she'd finished the sentence. And then it spread the way things spread when 300 people have been holding their breath for the same reason. She raised one hand slightly, and the room quieted again. I want to be clear about something. I am not angry at a hotel. I am not angry at a security guard. I am pointing at a pattern that every person of color in this room has encountered in some form, and I am saying, out loud, in this room, in front of this audience, it is not acceptable. It was never acceptable. And the fact that I have a title that changes how the story ends does not make the story acceptable. It makes it more complicated. She looked out at the room. The question I want you to sit with today is not, what happens when someone powerful is mistreated? The question is, what are we doing for the person who isn't? By 3 in the afternoon, video of the keynote was moving through veteran networks and social platforms with the velocity of something that had been waiting to be said. By 5, local Atlanta news had picked up the lobby incident. By 7, it had reached national coverage. The footage was not dramatic in the conventional sense. No shouting, no physical confrontation, no climactic confrontation caught in perfect resolution. What it showed was quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling. A woman being managed, redirected, minimized, while another guest walked past unimpeded. And then it showed a police officer reading a military ID, and the entire posture of the lobby shifting in a single moment. Grant Pelham did not appear on camera. He did not make a statement. By the time the story reached the evening news cycle, the hotel's regional management had confirmed that his employment status was under review and that the incident had been referred to the company's equity and compliance division. Officer Damon Fitch, for his part, did something that most people in his position did not do. He called Brigadier General Burrell's office that afternoon and asked if there was a way to speak with Colonel Obie Weston directly. Not for the cameras, not for the record, just to say that he was sorry he hadn't asked sooner and that he understood, in a way he hadn't at 7 that morning, that being asked was a privilege the situation shouldn't have required her to wait for. Burrell passed the message along. Serena read it twice. She told Burrell to tell Fitch that she appreciated it and that she hoped he'd carry it forward. In the months that followed, the hotel chain announced a mandatory bias training program for security personnel at all 217 of its properties. Not framed as a response to the incident, which legal counsel advised against, but implemented on a timeline that left little room for interpretation. The National Veterans Leadership Summit moved its contract to a different venue the following year, taking its 300 delegates, its catering budget, and its media presence with it. Lawrence Thibault issued a public statement that used the word regret 6 times and the word accountability not at all. Karen Solis, the regional manager, left the company 14 months later to pursue other opportunities, which was the professional equivalent of the hotel lobby redirecting her toward the exit. Grant Pelham's administrative leave became permanent separation. He filed a grievance. The grievance was reviewed. The review took 4 months and concluded that his actions had violated both hotel policy and the basic obligation of professional conduct. He did not get his job back. None of this was on the news. These were the quiet sequels to the loud moment, the slow institutional corrections that happen in boardrooms and HR files, rather than in front of cameras. They happen because someone made the story impossible to ignore. And because 300 people in a ballroom went home and talked about what they'd heard. And because a woman, in a worn peacoat, with mud on her boots, refused to walk to the corner and wait. Serena Obi Weston returned to the hotel once more 8 months later for a different event. She wore civilian clothes. She carried the same duffel bag. She walked across the lobby without being stopped. She checked in at the front desk, showed her ID in the ordinary, unremarkable way, and rode the elevator to her room. She stood at the window again, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. The light was different in the fall. Warmer, lower, cutting through the glass at an angle that made the whole city look, briefly, like something out of a photograph. She thought about the 31 countries. She thought about the tent camps, and the briefing rooms, and the budget meetings at the Pentagon. She thought about Fitch, who had asked instead of demanded. She thought about Petra, who had said Colonel with a clarity that filled the whole lobby. She thought about the person who had no rank to fall back on, who was just a person asking to be treated like one. She set down her bag. She made coffee. She stood up straight. There was still work to do. The next time someone tells you that things like this don't happen anymore, or that it couldn't happen here, or that one incident doesn't mean a pattern, remember that Colonel Serena Obi Weston had served this country for 26 years before she was stopped in a hotel lobby and told to wait in the corner until she could prove she belonged. Remember that the lobby changed the moment a piece of metal confirmed what she had said with her own voice and been disbelieved. The badge was real. The uniform was real. The service was real. What it took to be believed, that should never have been required. If this story stayed with you, share it. Leave a comment below. Do you think institutional apologies are ever enough? Or does real accountability look different? Subscribe to Voices of Truth for more stories that don't make the front page but should. The stories that matter most are the ones we refuse to stop telling.